Hello everyone. I'm delighted to share with you today the Marianne lecture of 2022 and my thinking on fields of power. I want to thank particularly Malcolm and all the Marianne organizers for this invitation, for their welcome and their care, and also for their work in keeping open this space that reflects what Marianne held dear, space for the exploration of newness, the exploration of our connection with each other individually and culturally. Unfortunately, I didn't know Marianne personally, but I wish I did. Our lives seem to share quite a few similarities. She was, like myself, an immigrant. She fled to escape war from Nazi Germany. And like me, she experienced conflict, war, and survived the Allied bombing, for example, that razed Dresden. And often in preparing this lecture, I thought of her. I read her interview with Judith Hemming in the British Gestalt Journal and imagined what she might have said about power. Yes, I know many of you might call this projection, but still very helpful in writing and researching this topic. So, let us start in very much a Gestalt way. In other words, with where you are. So just take a moment to write down what comes to mind for you when you think of power. Write it down in your own words without editing yourself or stopping. This won't be shared. It's just for you. For many of you, I imagine, this topic may bring up thoughts of coercion, of violence. But the power I want to talk about today can be even more toxic because it's more every day in our lives. Power that we often are blind to, that we normalize, that we take for granted, and yet that influence our actions and behaviors at every moment. These include economic, political and social forces which shape our world. These fields of power are of course always present and a crucial context to our lives and work. But how can we understand them and make sense of them? As some of you know, I come and grew up in the Lebanon, a country torn by war at the time, and I witnessed the violent and coercive nature of power. But looking back, what felt more constraining and limiting than the overt use of violence and power were the social divisions that polarized the country along sectarian, religious and political lines. The us and them, us versus them, that kept individuals firmly anchored in their beliefs that the other was wrong, bad, sometimes even evil. And I recall when I was young, it was said to me in no uncertain terms as a child after particularly an awful event in the then Civil War, that I would be ostracized, never be spoken to if I married someone from outside of my own community. I must have been about 8 or 9. Living in the UK then, in the late 80s and 90s, it seemed that I had left all that behind. I met a world of more liberal values, a world of seemingly plenty, where ideals of fairness and democracy, meritocracy and human rights, they all had a say. A world also where having power meant empowering others rather than subjugating them. But in recent years, I've seen a lot of these assumptions, as well as the institutions and norms that have shaped this world, fall apart. On the one hand, if we looked across history, a historian like Yuval Harari tells us that human beings have never had it so good. And yet in many parts of the world today we find so much disappointment. Disappointment that reveals itself in a variety of splits. For example, in the polarized politics in so many countries. Some of us would think and are talking about witnessing the return of a Cold War. A polarization and a split in fake news, the polarization of social media, the mainstream media, as well as very split public discourse on topics such as gender, race, identity, politics, refugees, and many other topics. And so today, more than ever, the levels of anger and anxiety on economic, social, and political issues seem to be rising. And associated with it, people feeling more insecure, more polarized than ever, and lacking the power to shape the future they want, or even at times safe enough to voice their opinions. So in choosing this topic, my wish is really to make sense of our relationship to power and powerlessness. Possibly to feel less powerless myself, and also to explore what that means for me personally as well as professionally. So in my work as a Gestalt psychotherapist, as a coach, as an OD consultant in organization, how can I be more aware of the impact of power? How can I be more ethical in my use of power? And how is that power playing out? Also, how can I understand power within a Gestalt theoretical framework? Ambitious questions, I know, and I hope that this lecture, this thinking and our conversation today will begin the dialogue around some of these questions. We know that Gestalt therapy in its early days was immersed in politics and emerged from strong liberal ideals of freeing, as Goodman's put it, the individual from the oppression of the state. But given the impact that political and social upheaval had on her life, I hope that Marianne would have approved of us spending this time today looking at issues of power in this way. So, where to start? I want to start by saying that power is neither good nor bad, it just is. Of course, it can be violent and coercive, but it's important to recognize that power can also be expansive to both parties involved in any exchange. Some power constraints that we even apply as therapists, for example, in our practice, are not unfriendly to our clients, but can be safe and holding. For example, when we set a firm boundary to our therapeutic sessions, or when we ask for ending sessions rather than an abrupt stop to the work. These two are examples of power that are supportive and holding. In French, the word for power is pouvoir, which also means to be able to. So power is also an enabler, a way of impacting and influencing the world around us. Power with rather than power over. And it's unfortunate that for many the word power still has connotation of coercion, because in my view, feeling powerless, shamed or disconnected, which are all consequences of and symptoms of what I think of as toxic power. And this disconnection, this shame can occur even without coerciveness. It can occur in situations where power is not used in an authoritarian or physically violent way over another. Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher and Holocaust survivor, writes that violence appears when power is in jeopardy, by which I believe she means that the exercise of power and influence more often happens with no visible violence at all, especially political power. And so power often is invisible, in ground, or at least not in conscious awareness, and is often only noticed through feelings of powerlessness, disconnect and shame. And it is of this type of power and powerlessness I want to speak of today, to better understand it, to notice it in my practice as a therapist and organizational practitioner. When I started looking at this and researching this topic from a Gestalt perspective, it was really interesting to see that the instances where power was mentioned in Gestalt texts had mostly to do with power as creativity, as showing up, as bringing all that we are to the moment. And most references to power in Pearl's, Haferline and Goodman's book Gestalt Therapy are about following your need and acting upon the world in a way that gets your needs met. And so they wrote, I quote, "Power and brightness comes from following the impulse of self-regulation." And I guess our forebearers in Gestalt did this well. They emphasized personal power, the charismatic gurus, often quite provoking. And for those of you that know them, the Gloria videos, this fits well with the video where that showed Fritz Perls, the showman, aggressive and confrontative, an older, more expert man challenging a younger woman. And today we may cringe watching this, but isn't it interesting that comparatively little has been written about power in Gestalt since then? Thankfully, Gestalt theory has also moved on since that time, and contemporary Gestalt is a relational practice where we recognize that all behavior is situated. In other words, that being powerful or powerless is always a function of the field. And so any behavior or feeling necessarily emerges from a given context and a set of relationships in the moment. So, let me expand next on these 2 points, that power is both first relational and second contextual. So first, Gestalt theory tells us that all experience is relational. What do we mean by that? We mean that being powerful or powerless are not set attributes of the person, but happen necessarily in relationship. A way of viewing this is saying that feeling powerful or powerless has to do with me, aspects of myself, and how I'm relating to the other and the situation I find myself in. This self-other situation, which I call the SOS model, or lens, which I've written about with Celine Vaughan and that we use in relational change, is helpful in recognizing the relational quality of power. Power or powerlessness aren't set attributes of the individuals, but happen in relationship in the moment. We can, for example, all recall moments where we felt powerful or powerless, and it had to do with our sense of ourselves. For example, how confident or competent did we feel? Were we anxious? Did we know our stuff, etc.? Or on the other we're with, were they on my side? Were they likely to disagree, to agree with me? And of course, on the situation, how supportive was the immediate situation? Did it feel constrained? Were rules set to limit my choice, my freedom? And we can all relate to this, having lived through many restrictions through especially the COVID pandemic. Imagine, for example, going for a job interview and the difference in my sense of power if I feel confident in putting myself forward, if I meet friendly and open people, if I'm offered a drink when I arrive, or alternatively, if the room is set up in an adversarial way and I face a stony face panel. We all know and we can all understand the impact on our sense of power in these 3 lenses. So let's just have a very short reflective pause here. Take a minute, and bring to mind a recent event where you felt powerful or powerless. And using the lenses of self, other and situation, just think what was going on for you. What might have enabled or not your feeling powerful or powerless. Okay. Well, hopefully that was helpful, and we'll hear more of your experience and your thoughts later. So coming back to the SOS model, often when a client or coachee comes with feeling powerless, we focus on their sense of themselves, their abilities, or on how their own personal experience of powerlessness is being re-triggered in the moment, their self-lens, or on how much support they seek or have through others, the other lens. Because as therapists and coaches, we know that being in connection with others is the most healing aspect of shame and disconnect. Or in fact, we may wonder, very rightly, what is it about this particular situation that invited powerlessness? But is exploring the sense of self, relationship with other, an immediate situation always enough to fully understand power dynamics being enacted? And I want to put to you that it is not. It is not, because power, in fact, is also contextual. And this is where I want to differentiate between the present immediate situation and the wider context. As therapists, coaches and supervisors, we may in the moment be feeling supremely confident, at ease, comfortable in a here and now situation, even in good working alliance with the other person in the room. The present moment situation is supportive. And yet, when I sit with a particular client or discuss a particular topic with a supervisee, I can suddenly become aware of my privilege, my power, or encounter shame and withdrawal. Let me give you some examples. I supervised a practitioner I am very fond of. She would travel to me from her small town in the north of England because she couldn't find the supervisor she wanted to work with closer to home. She would stay in London with a friend overnight and then take the train and travel down to meet me the next morning. And after a few months, she came in and she really brought her discomfort, her displeasure, because she said she was feeling she didn't even have the time to visit the toilet when she came and arrived to me, without it eating into the allocated time that we had together. And she'd sat with this feeling resentful, not valued, not feeling less important. And of course, my initial reaction was to be defensive. Why would she be, different to any other supervisee? This was the contracted time we had, and I had to keep boundaries. And also, I happened to have very full days on the days she came to me. However, in exploring this with her, what we both had initially missed is the wider field of privilege in which we sat. That she felt she needed to travel to London to have supervision that wasn't so available to her where she lived. That London, the south, was where people with more privilege would have access to more supervisors, more choice. So for me, this is an example where we can't put our finger on what isn't right in the immediate situation. The wrong, the violence can't be articulated. There is no abuse or manipulation to speak of. And yet power looms large and usually signaled through shame, withdrawal, anger, or feeling powerless. And this speaks to power being contextual, inground in our culture, in our customs. Another example from my organizational practice, I coached a young African woman who was working as an accountant in a very prestigious firm. And despite, her amazing credential and clear abilities, which were actually appreciated in her workplace, she felt she needed to work hard almost at every meeting. She'd struggle to disconnect from her work at weekends and evenings, and that to the detriment of her family and relationships. All of this to overcome a very subtle effacement, a sense of feeling dismissed by her colleagues, which of course had to do with her status as a migrant, despite having a European passport, and of course a young African woman in her industry. In these, two examples, turning our attention to ourselves, our connection with others and the immediate situation is not enough. Not enough to understand or uncover power dynamics. Because power in each of these cases inhabits structures of ground, historical and social layers and ingrained ways of being. You could almost say it lingers in the normality of the way we are in our customs and culture. And it's often only sensed through our bodies and emotions, through feelings of shame, withdrawal and powerlessness. Emotions which are often left unspoken or, even worse, falsely attributed to some personal failing. So the way I think about this is that in these cases the fields of power that we are embedded in have moderated the relational moment. They have interrupted the SOS, the self-other situation dynamics in the moment. So let's have another quick pause to digest. Take a moment to reflect on how these fields of power have moderated the relational moment for you. Maybe bring to mind a moment where you felt less than or powerless, shamed, when the cause was not obvious. It might be the same example you thought of earlier, or maybe a different one. A moment where the cause of your feeling wasn't obvious, where there was no offender or offense. And just pair up, maybe share with your neighbor, just for a few minutes, how might have the culture or wider context impacted the moment. Okay, welcome back. We will debrief later, but hopefully you could all bring to mind a time or moment where aspects of the wider field and context and culture in which you were immersed impacted the relational moment. And this, of course, could be as simple as being outside of your own culture in a different country with different norms. Or it could have been due to the atmosphere of a place, for example, the grandiosity of a cathedral that you might be visiting, or even the imposing reception area in the headquarters of a big financial organization. Or even, I recall, for example, when I traveled to Syria in my youth to play sports, and I remembered my embodied reaction to the amount of poster images of the Syrian president, or should I say dictator, really plastered on most walls in the gym I was visiting. The power of the political context was very loud indeed. But when I say fields of power moderate the relational moment, if I paused here, most of the time this contextual power, these fields of power, are not in conscious awareness. They are not explicit or even particularly noticed, as they're often part of what is habitual or normalized. But if power is so omnipresent, in-ground and largely invisible, which is how the French philosopher Michel Foucault describes it, how does our Gestalt theory help us recognize it? How can we notice it within our work so that rather than being trapped in an unaware and potentially toxic power dynamic, we can have a way of understanding and recognizing it? So what I want to do now is talk you through two ways fields of power moderate the relational moment. But before doing that, I want to build first on the work of and ideas really of Kurt Lewin and Pierre Bourdieu, two field theorists. So starting with Kurt Lewin or Levine, it's not a surprise, I hope, for Gestaltists to go back to Lewin. He is, after all, the father of field theory and provides a core building block, I would say, to our Gestalt practice and thinking. So Kurt Lewin was the first social psychologist, all the way back in the 1936, to speak of psychological forces influencing behavior. And he famously stated that understanding the field or the life space of an individual is understanding behavior. And although he doesn't name it as a particular aspect of power, Lewin's force field analysis presupposes constant influences and power being enacted on a person's psychological life space, or what he calls fields. In other words, we all are constantly subjected to forces in our field, in our phenomenal field, which shape our behavior. In particular, Lewin recognized the psychological boundaries of the life space of an individual or group. And he wrote of a notion he called the space of free movement. And I find this really interesting because it's a notion that's not often quoted in our Gestalt literature. And so, according to Lewin, the space of free movement is defined as, and I quote, the totality of regions to which the person in question has access from his present position, and that this space of free movement for an individual or a group is determined by ability, what's allowed, and other factors such as social position and the character of social relationships. So what Lewin was drawing attention to here is that what might limit or constrain us or even enable us in our freedom, in our movement, in our power, has to do with 1, ability, 2, relationships, and 3, our social positioning. Interestingly, all aspects that can superimpose on the SOS self-other situation model that can shape the self-other situation. But you might ask, and rightly ask, which abilities, what connections, and what type of positioning provide us power? And it's reflecting on this that took me to the work of Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu is another sociologist and field theorist who actually wrote extensively about power and culture. And interestingly, both Lewin in the first half of the 20th century and then Bourdieu in the second half were both influenced in their thinking about fields by the work of the German-born philosopher Ernest Cassirer. And Bourdieu writes that each specific social space, what he calls field, has within it aspects that are emphasized or not to influence and signal power. So like Lewin, Bourdieu writes that power is signaled when an aspect of ourself is highlighted, is made figural, what he calls personal capital, or an aspect of our relationships, our social capital, or an aspect of our positioning or our belonging. All this as a way of influencing what is happening in the moment. Let me give you an example. I spoke when researching this topic to different people and how they experience this type of power signaling in their lives. And speaking to the CEO of a public sector organization who also happened to be a black woman, she described this power play by noticing that when people met her, people that particularly wanted to influence her or her decision, they attempted to either demonstrate their competence or expertise, so making figural their personal capital, or call upon the intimacy of the relationship by name dropping, for example, or again at times find the common ground and a sense of positioning between them, for example, that they both belong to the black community or to a certain professional group. We do this intuitively, I feel, and even my 12-year-old daughter has learned this, as she always asks to go up to the Lebanese takeaway nearby and ask for her order in Arabic, because she says, maybe then he might give me some free chips too. So we clearly learned this very young. So what Bourdieu tells us is that in every field, what gets emphasized in service of gaining power or influence is the dominant view, the dominant narrative. So it isn't just any type of personal or social capital, but aspects that are valued in the dominant narrative and culture. Aspects that Bourdieu says give symbolic power. So, for example, knowing Gestalt theory won't give me any power with my nearly teenage kids, no street cred whatsoever. Because, when you think about it, in each situated field, there's a dominant narrative about what is valued, what's recognized, what's appreciated. And it influences how we are and also who's at the top of that hierarchy. For example, if we go back to, let's say, the 1950s, being middle class, white, male and heterosexual was the dominant position in a Western social field, and in some places still is. And in organizations, we see this play out too. So when people become aware almost intuitively that they might not hold a voice or a view that will be recognized or appreciated within a particular organizational culture. And we've all had those moments where we think we're the only one in the room that holds a particular view. And rather than speak up, we say nothing. And we're not alone. In fact, research carried out in the US shows that nearly 2/3 of all adults admit to this kind of self-silencing. So these dominant views, these narratives, are often not held or recognized consciously. They're ingrained ways of being that, even when not highlighted at all, are part of the normal way of being in the world. And that is what Bourdieu calls the habitus. So these dominant views are usually reinforced through structures, through norms, in very, very subtle ways. For example, whose opinion is listened to most? Who gets invited to speak first? What people wear, how they express themselves, their accents, their language, their expression. And these are not seen as conscious ways of exerting power. But, oh goodness, they can nonetheless be quite toxic. And this habitus is mostly unconscious, of course, because it is the familiar status quo of the field we inhabit. Familiar in a very implicit or tacit way, even in an embodied way, I would say. It's about knowing how to do things, such as how to act or how to engage in different social situations or in relation to different orthodoxies. I give an example, coming first to London, really implicitly knowing that you just don't say hello or meet anyone else's eye when you're traveling on the underground, for example. Bourdieu writes that encountering a world which matches your own habitus is like being, and I quote, like being a fish in water. It does not feel the weight of water and takes the world about itself for granted. But of course, when you're not that fish in water that doesn't feel the weight of the water, then you become more conscious of the dominant narrative and try in various ways to gain power, to achieve a greater freedom of movement. Hassan Haj, a Lebanese-Australian professor of anthropology in Melbourne, wrote when he was researching Lebanese immigrants in Australia, that those who were of a Christian faith would make a point of wearing a small cross on a necklace around their necks to signal their Christian faith and also to signal their belonging to the dominant group of the country that were also Christian, of course, in Australia. So what Bourdieu tells us is that any given field is also a field of struggle, a struggle over the field's logic and hierarchy, almost the structure of the field itself. And so where patterns of domination and submission are formed, maintained, and Bourdieu says, and sometimes thankfully changed. So how can we be attentive to these fields of struggle, to these fields of power, to the power signaling that is so invisible that it is the normal way of being in the world? I want to propose two main ways in which fields of power moderate or interrupt the relational moment. So the first moderation is when my or the other person's personal capital, remember that's the word that Bourdieu used to mean skill, ability, knowledge, not just economic capital. When this personal capital suddenly becomes figural, suddenly stands out as it is privileged or valued in this moment, in the dominant discourse within the field. For example, it happens when, for example, if you were an English speaker at an international conference where the language is English, having this privilege of language, this personal capital in this situation, provides me clearly with a certain power. It is, however, normative power. There is no oppressor or oppressed. It's just the way the world is. Being able-bodied can be a privilege. It's a type of power in many, many situations, as the world unfortunately provides so many obstacles to various kinds of disabilities still. Being cisgendered is a privilege in some situations, as it allows you to go out in the world without being overly noticed and suffering the exposure that many non-gendered people suffer from when they walk, for example, out on the street. Most of the time, this power imbalance isn't even in our awareness, because as human beings, we're often blind to the inconsistency of privilege when it comes to ourselves. We want to unname, we want to disown our privileges, and instead we get more preoccupied by our disadvantages. It's a phenomena that Malin Fors in her book calls privileged blackout. What happens in these moments is that there's an aspect of self or personal capital which is made figural and is privileged by the habitus and dominant narrative of the field. And so the privilege of that particular ability, skill, knowledge, this education, this able-bodiedness, this accent even, is brought to the fore, usually by the situation, and creates a power differential. For example, we can, I'm sure, agree that in therapy, the situation favors recognizing the therapeutic skill and power of the practitioner. And we have probably all come across times where this hasn't set well with some of our clients, who may possibly feel they should be in the superior position despite coming to us and needing our help. And this sense of being subordinated or powerless in this context can initially lead to a variety of ways of acting out. Everything from dismissing the therapist's input to finding other ways to highlighting their ability, for example, by talking about their experience or job expertise, or even by making a more light-hearted joke, as one of my clients asked as we walked up my garden path, to the therapy cabin, and she turned around to me and she said, "So who's leading who down the garden path then?" Bourdieu's thinking encourages us to name and recognize, of course, this power differential and confirm our clients in their power as well as recognize their vulnerability. Because when this power differential is not recognized, when this capital and privilege is not acknowledged, or as Bourdieu writes, when it is misrecognized, by which he means legitimized or taken for granted, then that is what leads to symbolic violence. If we go back to the conference example, for instance, It's being at a conference where the majority are not native English speakers, and yet it didn't even occur to the mostly British or American keynote speakers to slow down their speech or simplify their language. And this is experienced as a taken for granted, inevitable almost state of affairs. Not just to the speakers, but even to the non-English speaker or participants who accept this as a given. And this is where Bourdieu offers a definition of symbolic violence. And he says, and I quote, "Symbolic violence is a gentle violence, imperceptible and invisible even to its victims." The second moderation I'd like to talk about, or the second way in which power moderates the relational moment, is when power is not attached to the individual or personal capital, but instead configures the situation. It configures the situation along, I think, along lines of belonging. So what becomes figural is a person's position or belonging, as valued or not in the dominant discourse within the field. Let me give you an example. Imagine this situation. It's the middle of a work meeting with clients. There's a little group gathered with their clients. There's good discussion going on between participants who all happen to be men, apart from one woman. And then they break for coffee. And all the male colleagues and clients carry on with the discussion as they head to the men's toilets. The moment is brief, the woman's sense of exclusion real, and when they resume their meeting, she feels she needs to work harder to make clever points and not disappear. Now, her contribution to the meeting was clear and is clear. Her skill or ability were never in question. But an aspect of feeling less than creeps in. The wider field of gendered privilege has impacted the present moment. And some therapists might argue that this feeling has maybe to do with her own intrapersonal issues, that she should work harder to overcome this, and that it might, for example, stem from her prior experiences, and that she should take responsibility for her feelings. And some of that might be worth exploring, of course. But I don't think that explains the full response to a very real, wider field of struggle. So the present moment situation in this case got polarized and crystallized along lines of belonging. Crystallized into us versus them, with dominant narratives about what is valued, what is more worthwhile. In this example, specifically issues of gender privilege in the workspace. And of course highlights that the symbolic power that men still have in the workplace, still very much today. And going back to symbolic power, it's the misrecognition of it, of this dominant narrative, the normalization, the legitimization of it that can create the symbolic violence. I spoke, for example, in researching this again, to a woman who was amongst the first women to work as a manager in an insurance company in the 70s. It was difficult to miss her shame as she reflected on how normal it was back then when she started work to be whistled at or even tapped or pinched when walking down the corridor at work. And no one thought anything of it. It was just the way the world was. And it's just the way the world is. So in therapy or coaching, it's important to understand and acknowledge the powerlessness of our clients when faced with symbolic power and violence. Especially, I feel, if we don't happen to come from that minority or grouping, but from a more privileged group. Because it might be easy to think the client is being, let's say, oversensitive or not behaving well enough according to the standards of the dominant normativity. I worked, for example, with an Asian, a coachee that was from an Asian background. He was brilliant, very capable, but also excluded from the all-white British senior group, despite bringing quite a large chunk or share of the profit to the organization. We could, of course, discuss his reluctance to act more bold, more macho, his perhaps quieter disposition, which were true, but that isn't the full story, and it's important to recognize the subtle and even unconscious othering. And interestingly enough, I often find reluctance in my clients or coachee themselves to discuss or accept the reality of unconscious prejudice, of symbolic violence. And instead what they do, they keep working on themselves, that they internalize that if they tried harder, then this us versus them won't matter so much. Or is it perhaps that it's easier to work on themselves and adapt than change a dominant cultural discourse? We can, I'm sure, those of us that work with trauma recognize here a trauma response to try and adapt, to be seen and recognized. Now, in looking at the second moderation, belonging isn't only, of course, about identity politics, even though that dimension seems to shape a lot of power behavior these days. It's also about ethical and political values, which also create very strong polarizations. The Leave versus Remain split, the Republican versus Democrat split in the US at the moment, for example, as well as belonging to places, countries, region, geographical, national sort of splits. Again, these are not always fixed categories where people slot in, but these politics of belonging might emerge suddenly or even unexpectedly, I would say. For example, I'll give you a personal example. I'm part of a very supportive and loving supervision group where I feel welcomed, accepted. And at the start of the Ukraine war, when my colleagues were voicing their shock, some of my colleagues mentioned that it was particularly horrible, shocking that such a thing could happen happened in Europe to people that were like us. The implication being, of course, that such wars could happen in the Middle East or African countries, where this was more acceptable, more bearable, more expected. And at some level, I guess it is the state of the political landscape. But for me, suddenly, the situation polarized into us and them. I was othered in my sense of belonging to a certain geographical place, to the Lebanon, to the Middle East, which seems to be associated with war and conflict. And we all have many identities, many aspects of belonging. And this polarization may also become exacerbated when we feel threatened and less secure, naturally, and less secure in any one aspect of our belonging. When we find, for example, ourselves in some way part of the minority group. And it's undoubtedly true that, as a rule, the emotional component of people's sense of themselves and their identities becomes even more central to them, more important to them, the more threatened and less secure they become. It's a reminder, I believe, that we all need some sense of power and freedom of movement to feel safe and secure. And of course we try and achieve it in a multitude of ways. Living in the Lebanon, I've seen this same polarization take place in people who have returned to the country, for example, let's say after a long time spent abroad. And their initial inclusivity and more liberal, and more liberal dispositions soon disappear when they start feeling unsafe or threatened in their sense of belonging to a community or religious faction. This polarization of the situation along lines of belonging and privilege speak, of course, many of you would have recognized it, to the idea of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. And if you don't know her work, please look it up. She's got a great TED talk that's worth watching. And basically, what she points out that we all have many identities, and that your experience as a human being is more than just the sum of these identities. So, for example, that being a black woman in America isn't just about being black, American and female, but that there are unique obstacles and indignities, she says, that affect African American women. And that the world isn't equal and fair across all groupings. And that power, and usually wealth, has sat in some groupings more than others. As a therapist working with refugees or people from war-torn countries, I'm acutely aware of my privilege to pass as white European and to hold a Western passport. My privilege in not having, for example, to queue at border control checkpoints. And equally, I can sit with the privilege of my white British client, born and raised in the leafy Surrey, who have never even had to even consider such issues or worry about what their passport says about where they were born. So what Bourdieu tells us again is that this toxic power, this symbolic violence, is the misrecognition, the legitimization of privilege and oppression as it plays out in the moment. It isn't about using intersectionality as a morality map where white heterosexual men are the bad oppressors and coloured gay women the victims. Because we're very rarely either completely innocent or completely guilty. We're seldom in either complete powerlessness or total omnipotence, because being human means bearing the complexity of privileges and subordination as they play out in the moment, however difficult that might be. And taken to extreme, I think intersectionality is about recognizing, as Gordon Wheeler puts it, the culture of one. Therefore, to only see intersectionality along the binary lines of oppression and privilege creates a map of morality that people are divided into the morally bad oppressors and the morally good victims. And Jonathan Haidt says or writes, common enemy identity politic is toxic, but common humanity identity politics is very, very much needed. So the power dynamics between my client and me is therefore not static. It's not determined by our identity alone, but it emerges in the moment as features of our ground and context are highlighted, when our habitus is made more explicit, and when contextual power makes figural an aspect of our self or situation, an aspect of our personal capital or of our positioning and belonging. I want to next go from the personal to a bit the systemic. So having covered how the misrecognition, the legitimization of our personal capital or an aspect of our belonging creates symbolic power and disrupts the relational moment at the personal level, I think we can also see this enacted at a systemic level, interestingly enough, through two major power plays in the world today, which can be perceived as polarizing or splitting the individual from the collective. So what are those two power plays? The first power play is what I call the tyranny of merit. It happens when people or organizations or even whole countries focus into the self lens, so they're blind to the situation, to the other. And they polarize so much as only to recognize the value of ability or personal capital. This is what Michael Sandel, the American political philosopher, called the tyranny of merit. He argues that meritocracy, which is a very prevalent, very liberal notion in the West, tells us that those that are successful, that are at the top, it's because they deserve it. It's because of their ability. And those that are not, it's their fault for not earning it or for not even working hard enough for it. And this view, of course, is quite prevalent and makes us buy into this myth of the self-made and self-sufficient individual. And it's deeply unjust because it pretends that people succeed just because of their own ability. And it ignores everything and everyone that has helped them get there, whether it's rich parents, connected teachers, systems or institutions they're part of. This misrecognition of privilege and symbolic power is large. In this case, only individual achievement and ability is taken into account, and the unaware exclusion practices that have led to these achievements are so inground that they just appear like they're the natural order of things. And Bourdieu's work here is really useful as it reminds us that most situations include a bias towards the more powerful already. Interesting quote, isn't it? And I find that as therapists or coaches, we can lean too much into the self lens when we're tempted to say to our clients, if you only tried harder, you would make it. Or if you only went to university, it will all be okay. Or more likely, we can become confluent with our clients' own interjects that if they were more clever, they would have been successful or happy. This leaning can only result, I think, in shame in our clients or for our clients around personal achievement, academic attainment, all the trappings of what signals personal success and power in the world today. The second systemic power play happens when there's too much focus into the situation lens. That means each situation is seen as a battleground between dominant and dominated group. And that means we lose sight of the other or even the individual's phenomenological experience. And the battle around identity politics today seems to be such an example. The phenomena of cancel culture on university campuses takes this power struggle to extreme. And so only identifying, for example, as part of a minority dismisses the phenomenological experience and even the potential to be different in some situations. Of course, not all black people feel or think the same, not all women or gay people have the same experience. But unfortunately, when the situation becomes so rigidified into us versus them, and the groundswell of power takes over, individual experience as well as relational connections are both lost. And the power of the situation becomes such that nothing else matters. It's leave versus remain, Palestinians versus Jews. Every interaction is then seen as a power play. It becomes a battle around either who's better, who's in the right, or even who's suffered more or more oppressed and therefore is entitled to more. A kind of a social activism, I would say, for the oppressed, which makes, unfortunately, a mockery of the very much needed activism for situations that require it most. Robert Greene, in his book 48 Laws of Power, writes that individuals don't emphasize publicly their weakness without a self-interest or a power move. And that, I quote, true powerlessness without any motive of self-interest would not publicize its weakness to gain sympathy or respect. Making a show of one's weakness is actually a very effective strategy, subtle and deceptive in the game of power. And this is not to say that there are not many, many, many social, political and economic issues that need us to fight and keep fighting for and to keep highlighting. The need for equity, not just equality, is a constant battle about which I think we all need to stay aware and vigilant. So, in conclusion, finally, what does all this mean for us and our practice? I guess first we must, as practitioners immersed in fields of power, whether they're social, economic, or political, we must stay informed, be aware, curious about how changing cultures and customs may be shaping fields of power. Because when we do that, we then may or might even avoid placing the burden or the responsibility for shame, powerlessness at the individual level, and have a better chance to recognize the fields of power we're immersed in. As I said at the start, Paul Goodman sought in his contribution to Gestalt to free the individual from the oppression of the state. And of course, in his time, the sequels of the Second World War, the Holocaust and Hiroshima all pointed to the failures of the state and governments, those very legitimate authorities who held power. However, today in our contemporary world, legitimate authority has, I think, and feel largely been supplanted. And power has become more diffuse, more decentered, more desubjectified. So we're, for example, more likely to speak of the power of Silicon Valley and the influence of social media on our culture and our youth. And so with power being more diffuse, we can't any longer point the finger just to the leader or politician and blame him or her. Today, I guess more than ever, that the future of a better and less divided world lies with each one of us, with our capacity to use power wisely, to contain, to support, to collaborate rather than dominate. Yasha Monk, in his book called, I think, The Great Experiment, writes about how democratic stability varies in different societies. And he points out that, in fact, ethnic diversity is not destabilizing by itself, but rather diversity challenges democracy when it hardens into a winner-take-all struggle for power between two sides, the dominant and an oppressed side. I witnessed this in my childhood in the pre-Civil War Lebanese society, where mixing across religion and communities was natural. And then the rise of Arab populism, the Israeli victory in 1967, as well as the Iranian Revolution, suddenly set the scene at a systemic level, at a world level, for a split between religions. In other words, when ensuring all groupings have some power, some freedom of movement, is probably the best way to ensure a stable society. We are, of course, all interrelated, and each one of us needs to take responsibility within the fields of power we inhabit. And of course, an essential aspect and component for this is a reflexive stance towards ourselves. How can we get in touch with our own internalized privilege and subordination? How can we each sit with the knowledge that none of us is entirely innocent or entirely guilty? We can see that the moderations I spoke of earlier polarized into the self and situation lenses. And ultimately the answer to both these polarized positions lies in reaching to the other, not just through understanding, which we might not always be able to do as we each inhabit our own habitus, but reaching out with compassion. As Gestalt practitioners who work with embodiment, I think we need to be attentive to the shifts in ourselves and others that signal shame and powerlessness. As we know, cognitive understanding is a bit like the cavalry. It arrives often too late. So let us listen to the wisdom of our bodies and sense the power shifts in the field, which are always an early signal that will allow us to slow down and reach to the other. Finally, Finally, we need to bring these social and political struggles to our work openly, to our therapy, coaching, organizational work, to our supervision work, and dare to speak them not just when we are of the same opinion or side than our client, but mostly when we differ. In his last talk in English in 1983, the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault made a speech on the subject of parrhesia, and I quote, "Parrhesia is a verbal activity in which a speaker expresses his personal relationship to truth and risks his life because he recognizes truth-telling as a duty to improve or help other people as well as himself." So, when we're all immersed in fields of power, we can either succumb to them or choose to speak truth to power. And I hope today has gone some way to support and enable this truth-telling. I would like to end this with a song called Nina Cries Power by Hosier Mavis Staples, and a tribute to all those activists who spoke and still speak up against toxic power.